Hey, sustainability champions, Daniel Hartz here. Did you know 80% of mass-produced flowers grown in the US often come from outside the US, and they're grown using harsh chemicals and pesticides? Well, today I'm speaking with sustainability champion Debra Prinzing, the founder of the Slow Flowers movement, who saw this challenge and decided to do something about it. The Slow Flowers movement is all about sourcing flowers that are grown locally, seasonally, and without any chemicals. Debra's website, slowflowers.com, connects consumers to farmers, florists, and grocery stores, offering domestic blooms to make it easier to find each other. Debra has written 2 books on the topic. The first one is Slow Flowers, 4 Seasons of Locally Grown Bouquets from the Garden, Meadow, and Farm. And the second one is the 50-Mile Bouquet, Seasonal, Local, and Sustainable Flowers. So I'm really looking forward to learning more about the solution to what turns out to be a pretty big environmental challenge. Debra, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Daniel. How are you?
I'm doing very, very well. Yeah. And how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
Likewise. Yeah. And where are you joining from?
I'm joining you from Seattle, Washington, the Pacific Northwest corner of the United States.
Beautiful. Very green part of the country. And for those of you who are watching this live, just to put this out there, please feel free to type questions or comments in the chat for Debra. I'll be watching them. I see Maria Petrova says hello from London. Hello, hello. And I'll be watching that, and we can get those questions answered for you. So today, Debra, I'd like to cover 3 things. Number 1, really what the Slow Flower movement is and how it works. Then go into the moment you realize this is what you wanted to do. And from there, we'll talk about what we can all do to be more environmentally friendly in our daily lives. So how does that sound?
I love it. Sounds great.
Excellent. Well, let's jump straight into it. I think that's enough for me. So going into the Slow Flowers movement, what is it? It's a term that I actually came across only very recently. So what is it all about?
Well, I think you and probably a lot of your viewers have heard of the whole slow food movement, which has been around for decades and really was emerged as an anti-fast food kind of sentiment. It actually was originated in Italy, but it is global now. Right. And I borrow that term slow as a sort of way to explain that I support local, sustainable, and seasonal flowers. So it's very similar in the food to what's happening in the food world. Flowers are kind of catching up, though. So when the philosophy started, it really was just a shorthand way for me to explain to people what I was writing about, because I had gotten into this project. You mentioned one of my books. This is the book, The 50-Mile Bouquet, which came out 9 years ago, and that reference is kind of also borrowed from the food world, because there was this whole concept of the 100-mile diet. And I was like, oh, it's like there's a term called food mile, and I was just adapting it to flower mile. And so the 50-mile bouquet was just actually not a rule, but kind of a metaphor for local. So anyway, yeah, it's been my obsession for the last 10 years. And really, as an advocate, an educator, and convener of a conversation, I'm trying to move the practitioners into this mindset, anybody in the floral industry. And I just want a seat at the table with like the mainstream commercial flower farming and sort of mainstream floristry to say, hey, there's a better way. There's another alternative. Have you thought about it? And in doing so, it's really been a bubble up kind of concept that that gardeners like me have been easily, they adopt that readily. Like, oh yeah, I grow flowers in my garden, or my neighbor grows flowers. Why am I getting them on a jumbo jet shipped from another continent when I know they grow in my neighborhood? And so that's sort of a pragmatic thing too. Like, okay, yeah, this doesn't make sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. So that 80% that I started with, that is what, when you go to just any supermarket or any store, really that's what you're looking at is.
Yeah. And actually I think you said 80% of mass produced flowers grown in the US, but you meant sold in the US, I think, when we started. And I was like, yeah, it's confusing because people think they're grown in the US when they see them at the grocery store. that number, and it may be it's probably very similar in other countries that have had their agriculture outsourced. So probably in the UK where you are, many places in Europe, Canada for sure. And so that number wasn't always that way.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And what in the US, what happened was in the late 80s, early 90s, there was trade legislation called the Andean Trade Preference Agreement, which basically was the so-called war on drugs to incentivize cocoa farmers in countries like Colombia and Ecuador to plant different crops. And so there were no tariffs on flowers coming in from those countries. And that's what decimated the US domestic floral agriculture world, the old world, when it wasn't 80%, when it was probably 20% it was the flipped. It was like 20% imports, 80% domestic. So
I think
it's just been this like drip, drip, drip ever since.
It's interesting because, it's kind of the sort of law of unintended consequences. You have these, you do one thing that is good, getting rid of, hopefully encouraging producers to switch from drug crops to flowers. But then, of course, that changes the way the economics of a whole other market works. Yeah. Actually, just a comment from Ian Stewart from Ireland. He says that at the markets he attends, the flower sellers grow their own flowers, and it's more like centimeters rather than kilometers because it's right next door.
I have a term you can. I just realized I didn't have the comment section turned on, so now I can see. Ian, thank you. I call it the 5-step bouquet going out my backyard, my back door to my cutting garden. So, yeah, that's yay for Ian. He's buying the right flowers.
Well done, Ian. So going back to the actual slow flower, so it's really about like you said, it's the concept of it's like slow food. So we're talking about local, meaning, well, you said 5 steps, which is hyper local, and then of course seasonal. So we're talking about flowers, or well, if we're starting with food, you're talking about food that's in season right now, and so we just apply that to flowers, and then chemical free as much as possible. So if we start with that first one about locality, and I know we just kind of talked about it, but on a more
let's unpack it.
Yeah. So what does it really mean that the flowers are local, and who are we talking about when we say that these need to be local flowers? Yeah,
it's really hard to put your finger on it because it's such an elastic term. I searched far and wide to find out if the U.S. government had a definition of local. And there is in the USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, does have a policy where they describe local as within a 400-mile radius or within the state in which it's produced. So, a state like Rhode Island is tiny, and you can't travel 400 miles and still be in the state. Whereas California or Texas, it's massive. So that's sort of and that was applied to edible crops, right? And so that's one gauge. Obviously we talked about hyperlocal, which is excellent, but in terms of like commerce, a lot of florists are trying to. There are florists who are trying to source from within a 200-mile radius, and that means that they have to get really creative in the winter, and we can talk about that. But for others who are trying to be local in winter months, at least in the U.S., it means probably buying all your flowers from California or possibly Florida or Hawaii. And there is a transportation footprint in that. I don't want to be naive, but at least you're supporting a domestic flower farm. So I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, well, it is really complicated because ultimately, especially, and this kind of moves into seasonality, but once we start looking at winter flowers, I think summer flowers or spring flowers, it makes sense. They probably grow abundantly in most places. Yeah. But once you do move into winter, what do you do? I suppose the only way is really, like you said, you have to start importing them, or not importing, but really moving them from California. And is there any way? Well, I guess a question would be, is there a way to, or would you consider slow flowers being grown in a greenhouse?
Yes.
Does that count?
Yeah. And that's in the last, 15 years since I've been kind of documenting this, especially since the book came out, and my 2 books came out in 2012, 13. we've seen this thing called season extension really happening, especially among more artisan, small scale growers who are trying to really push the seasons. So they're using high tunnels or greenhouses to get, say, chrysanthemums into the fall, but just have anemones and ranunculus, while the ground's still frozen, because they're able to grow them under cover. So there's that innovation is happening in that realm. There were greenhouses all across America that were growing roses for until this Andean Trade Preference Agreement. And some of them are just they're in disarray, and there are people who are trying to restore and start up again, but it's really capital intensive. So, when I did this book, the Slow Flowers book, which is this one, the whole point of it was to create a bouquet every week for a year, using what was in my own garden or what I could get from a local flower farmer. So here's an example of a winter arrangement. It's twigs and cut up orchid plants, and that is the twigs.
Beautiful.
They were from my yard, and there was a sacrificial orchid involved. But this is another one that I'm sort of seeing happen. Like, this is all, let me get around my mic. This is all foliage and just evergreen plants from my region. And so the seasonality, the goal of seasonality is actually changing the aesthetic, because we're choosing plants that are available to us. So it is a quieter palette, or a little bit, a lot of, people are using house plants. People are using twigs and conifers. They're trying to just look at what's available in nature and see the beauty in that. So that's kind of an interesting byproduct. And you really see all of a sudden this understanding of seasonality. I don't want to see a peony in December because it's, shipped from Chile or something like that. I mean, or I see it and it seems out of place or odd. So it's kind of a subtle shift, but I'm definitely, I think that more florists who are practicing the slow flowers ethos and are changing what they're offering their clients in the winter months, it's sort of training the consumer to see the seasons again.
I think that's, as you're talking about, I think that's exactly the point, is really considering, the consumer really needs to rethink what it means to actually have, quote, flowers specifically. Because those examples, aside from the orchid, actually, that foliage one, there weren't, as far as I could tell, there were no flowers per se in them. It was just beautiful leaves that are all different colored, creating a very interesting and beautiful bouquet, and using that as kind of instead of flowers. There were
a few hellebores in there, but that's because they grow in my area. They may not grow everywhere for people.
Yeah.
But what you're talking about also, I wanted to comment on, is that in America, and probably in the UK too, the consumer marketplace works against seasonality, because we've been trained to have instant gratification. We've been trained by the commercial world to want everything all the time. And so, when you value seasonality, it does put you on a different course, and maybe you have to deny yourself something, but that's not bad. That's actually good for the environment. So
it's interesting. Yeah. Cause, if you compare it to food, it doesn't make any sense to eat tomatoes in the winter, because that's not when they grow. And I wonder, although this is strictly about food, but it's just an interesting thought, is I wonder if actually your body isn't really designed to even digest those kind of foods outside of that time period, because in the winter your body needs certain nutrients, and a tomato may not provide those nutrients because it's not designed to be ripe at that time.
I like that. Yeah, there's one thing I was going to mention. I hadn't thought about putting this on my list of comments, but when you said, in the winter you can't have tomatoes, I wanted to just jump in and say, that's why our grandparents learned how to preserve and can and dry and save that harvest for the time when it's not available. And that is happening in floristry as well. Mm-hmm. We're seeing this huge resurgence of people drying and preserving flowers and using those in the winter months. And, there's some amazing people are learning how to do it better and better than back in the 70s. And And again, consumers are seeing that as beauty and appreciating it and not thinking, oh, it's just something dry and brown,
Yeah. Well, I think if you're really good at it, sometimes it's in some ways even more beautiful than a fresh bouquet. It has its own distinct look, and when done correctly, I can think actually my mom has this one bouquet that's dried, and I've seen it my entire life. It must be, I don't know how many decades old.
I hope she's
point.
dusting it, because they do tend to. But they do kind of like represent a point in time, and I love that.
Yeah, it's fantastic. There's a comment from Maria Petrova who, speaking of food, says that she likes to buy seeds from local shops, but she's never seen seeds about, and I'm assuming this is about flowers in terms of edible flowers. So like, for instance, I'm actually growing some chives right now, and I've never seen a chive flower before. And they're these beautiful purple, they're not very big, but they're beautiful purple flowers. And so what about, edible flowers as an arrangement or a bouquet? Is that something that you're seeing?
Yes. And it's interesting because a lot of small scale growers, they're trying to develop as many channels as possible for what their, quarter acre is producing or whatever. And so many of them have found that edible flower, there's a demand among chefs and bartenders for edible flowers that are organic. And that's the real competitive edge they have, because they can, deliver something that's 100% organic, that hasn't been treated or with any kind of synthetic additive. And so I'm seeing people sell, like at the wholesale market by me, there are farmers who bring in little boxes of a selection of edible flowers, and they'll just sell that as a mix, like a confetti mix. So yes, I love that. I think it's another way to engage consumers in sustainable growing practices. Like, well, you are going to put that in your body. Maybe not the rose in your front yard, but the nasturtium and the borage is going to go in your cocktail. So you want it to be organic.
Absolutely. And
the chive.
Chive, yeah, absolutely. So does the just about this organic point, does slow flowers, if I hear that term, should I, or can I rather, assume that it is organic, or at least chemical free, or because organic means that it necessarily has a label on it?
Yes. But I mean, that in the US, organic has pretty much is run by the United States Department of Agriculture. And so you have to qualify for that certification. And I will just say that whole USDA certified organic was designed for the food industry.
Right.
And often like only one or two key crops. Most small scale flower farmers are highly diversified, and they have 50 or 100 varieties. It's much harder to meet those standards. And a lot of it is just the bureaucratic paperwork, and these small farmers don't even have employees. It's just a time thing. So there's a couple things that are happening. One is people use sustainability a lot, and that's a slippery slope, because you've got to figure out, what does that mean? There are some alternatives to USDA or certified organic. There's one called Certified Naturally Grown. And that's an organization that you can find it may be international. It's a peer-to-peer organization where farmers who volunteer to evaluate other farms, and they have credentials and all. So I think that's people proudly display Certified Naturally Grown. There's also regional ones in the Pacific Northwest, where I am. There's a designation called Salmon Safe. And I know you've been to my region, Daniel, so you understand that if you hear something safe for salmon, you're like, okay, it's safe for humans, because we are so passionate about preserving our salmon habitat. But it came out of the wine industry, and the vineyards were using it to say there is no runoff that is unsafe for the waterways. And so now the flower farmers are allowed to get that certification too.
That's cool.
Yeah. But in general, I have a Slow Flowers manifesto, and 2 of the 6 points in it talk about chemical-free practices. One is to encourage sustainable and organic farming practices that respect people and the environment. So that's geared toward the farmers. And then toward the florists, I say to eliminate waste and the use of chemical products in the floral industry. So that it's not green is not green. There's a lot of bad stuff, toxic chemicals being used by florists. And so part of my advocacy is to educate people about alternatives.
Interesting. So actually, and this is just to clarify. So what you're saying is that florists as well, once they get flowers, they also use chemicals.
Yeah, but yes, they do. They might be using some kind of like solution, to like a hydrating solution or something, which maybe on this continuum, maybe that's okay because it's, or it's got natural elements like like salix, which is a byproduct of willow, but but you don't know. Some of these are proprietary products, so you have to ask. Yeah. But the biggest sin in the floral industry is the green brick of floral foam, which is like a styrofoam like arranging mechanic. And I know you talked about this when Hitomi Gilliam was on. That is a formaldehyde-based single-use plastic, does not break down in landfills, is not biodegradable as much as these companies want to say it is. It biodegrades into microplastic, insidious little elements. So that's the big challenge in the floral industry, is to try to change those practices and show alternatives. That's the main one.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because it really is in that case. First, it's like it's a 3-step process. The first step is talking to the actual farmers, making sure that they're using chemical-free practices. And I don't want to use the word organic just because it has a very specific meaning, but like I suppose environmentally friendly practices.
A lot of people say I use organic practices. I think that's okay to say. Yeah.
That's true. And then, so that's step one. And then the next step is making sure that the florists take that and sort of respect that and continue without using any other kind of chemicals. Then I suppose the third step is really educating the consumer to understand that beauty may not always require certain flowers at certain times of year, or it doesn't need to look a specific way, which requires some of these chemicals.
I love the way you put that, but it's so true. Those are the 3 places where flowers, you can make an impact and have a positive change.
Absolutely, yeah. And I would imagine the consumer education is probably the most challenging.
It is. It really is. And, I get into these conversations with florists who say, well, my bride really wants white hydrangeas in January and I can't disappoint my bride. And I want to say, what you're the expert is, you need to bring them along. You need to show them alternatives that are better for the environment. And you feel empowered, and I think the Slow Flowers Society and our organization, we're trying to empower our members to make those right decisions, even if there's a perceived financial risk. Mm-hmm. But I think when they get a couple wins, then they feel emboldened to be a little bit more vocal about it. And I also think that the power of social media is really changing consumers' awareness of this as well, because there's a lot of sexy farm porn out there on Instagram that is so romantic and like so storybook almost, that it's changing what is our definition of beautiful. And that's a positive. I mean, I'm kind of poking fun at the internet, but, or at like Instagram, but it's doing the job. It's shifting attitudes.
Absolutely. And I follow some of those accounts, and it's wonderful to see. And you just sort of sit there, and it's like you said, it's very romantic. Speaking of the farming and going back to the food aspect, just wanted to read a comment from Chris Blackstone, who said that he loves seeing the revisit in terms of bouquets to the inclusion of fruits or even kale or lettuce in large bouquets, as we see in Flemish master paintings.
Yes.
As soon as he said the Flemish master, I remember, these massive cabbages and things.
Actually, Chris is a woman. She's a friend of mine from New England. Hi, Chris. Thanks for joining us. That's neat.
Yeah, I think it's a great. Sorry for saying she or he rather. I think that's a great point, because you really can get very creative. I think there's and maybe I suppose this goes back to that idea of consumer education, because when you go to any grocery store, you see a very similar type of bouquet. You know, whether you're in California, Seattle, or London, it's the same type of roses. It's the same type of like big daisy things, and they're beautiful. But there's the creativity there. It's very sort of mainstream, I suppose, is what you can call it.
It's a commodity. It's a commodity versus couture, you know, and that's what we're starting to be drawn to, is something that doesn't look mass produced.
Yeah. That's it's almost like boutique flowers. So you mentioned briefly that slowflowers.com, which is what we're talking about here. It's essentially a way for consumers, farmers, or I suppose for consumers to connect to farmers, florists, and grocery stores in order to get access easily to slow flowers. That's a very high level explanation. What is there more to slow flowers that you'd like to share?
Sure. I mean, basically, when I started the website, the online directory in 2013, it was right after the book Slow Flowers came out, and for 12 months I had been talking about, you know, support your, you know, you hear this term, know your food, know your farmer, and I was trying to co-opt it and say, know your flowers, know your farmer, or the other way around. Anyway, I kept saying, you know, I would talk about this at book signings or flower shows, and the audience, as well as the media, would say to me, okay, we drank the Kool-Aid, we love your idea, we want to get on board. How do I find a farmer? How do I find a florist who I know is sourcing from a farmer? You know, where are these people? And I kept saying, someone needs to start a directory. And, you know, somehow that became me. And I started it, and, you know, it became over time more than just paying a nominal amount of money to get your business listed on Slow Flowers. And now it's just this whole like marketing platform and community network of farmers and florists. So when the consumer comes to slowflowers.com, they can search by zip code, city, state, or type of flower, or specific thing like someone who designs weddings or whatever. You can search all that and find, we have about 880 members now. And so you can all across the US and many of the Canadian provinces. We have about 60 members in Canada. So you can do that. But that was a B2C solution. And then what came out of it was a B2B solution where florists were joining Slow Flowers and using the directory to find farmers to buy from. And farmers were starting to educate themselves about what does the floral marketplace really want, and developing a dialogue with those florists in their community and saying, well, what can I grow for you? What colors are going to be on trend next year? You know, and these two worlds, where's my hands? These two worlds weren't talking, and now they're finally reconnecting again through this forum.
That's amazing. It's so cool because you're making it easier for everyone. Wins this way. You know, you have consumers who they're looking for things, they don't know how to find it. They say, I wish we could do it. Well, it doesn't exist, so I'm just going to go buy roses from, like you said, Colombia. So you're helping the consumers. You're helping the florists who say, well, you know, I want to give this flower to you, but unfortunately we don't have it. And then you're helping the farmers because they know what to grow. And so everyone wins. It's a win-win-win.
Yeah. We just need more of it now. We need more people to do this.
Exactly. So actually just clearly the food aspect in floristry is fun for everyone. Rena, who says she remembers her office sending a bouquet when her brother passed away, and there was a huge cabbage in the middle, and she picked it out, and then her sister-in-law cooked it.
You know, I think that we're also fascinated, and when we see food used in a non-traditional way, and that is definitely, you know, Chris referred to the Flemish artist. It's not like we just invented this, but there's definitely a lot of fun, you know, just like florists who are intentionally buying cherry tomatoes on the vine to, you know, to work into some seasonal arrangement, because it's that wonderment, that aha moment that captures your imagination when you see it. So yeah, When I say flowers, I'm kind of broadly talking about your art supplies, any
Well,
botanical art supply.
I think that's a really important point because, when I hear flowers, I think, well, as we just talked about, mainstream bouquet from a grocery store.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. And as it turns out, and this is what I'm learning through this conversation as we're speaking, is it's actually a completely that's a very limited, that's one type of flower arrangement, but actually flower arrangements, and I have seen these, but I guess the point is to be a little bit more conscious of it, and more doing it with more, I'm blanking on the word right now, but really going after something that looks different.
Yeah, you actually have to be intentional about it. And the more we observe nature, the more we recognize that this is a different definition of beauty. It's a better definition of beauty than what, corporate floristry has told us. We have, I call it the dirty dozen. We have like this limited pool of, or bucket of flowers that we can choose from. Not so much.
Exactly.
Let's offer people more.
And it's good too, because then you can really find unique bouquets and unique ways of presenting things that are different, which I think people like. People like unique. Going back to kind of how this all started, what was that moment really when you realized that the slow flower movement? You mentioned that you were looking for others and all of that, and that's how it came about. But where did the real interest initially come from?
You asked me that question. You asked me to prepare for that question, and I thought I can't put my finger on a specific moment, like a big aha moment. But it was like this gradual, organic shift toward what has been an amazing career change for me over the past 15 years. I thought back to the first flower farmer I interviewed, and it was in 2004 when I was working on a book called The Abundant Garden about gardens on Bainbridge Island, which is this glorious garden-filled island, a 30-minute ride from Seattle by ferry. And there was a small home-based flower grower who had the end of the driveway flower stand with the honor system for paying for the neighbors paid for the bouquets. So something could have happened back then. I don't know, but I had this amazing home and garden writing career, producing books, writing for national magazines. I wrote for the LA Times for 10 years as a freelancer, and really had a wonderful career. But all along I kept stumbling into people growing flowers. And what really was a turning point, I'm glad you asked this question, because I actually had to sit and think about it for a while. But in 2010, on a whim, I went to the National Association of Specialty Cut Flower Growers Conference.
Wow.
Which is a large mouthful, but I'll say it, ASCFG is the short term. So it's this association that's been around for 30 years of small scale cut flower growers. Many of them are people who you would find at your local farmer's market. Mm-hmm. And they had a national meeting, and it was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and in the middle of November. So they can't even meet until flower season's over. And I was just, something sparked my interest at that meeting, at that conference. And it was this David and Goliath story of these unsung heroes who were fighting this international global wave of flowers being imported, and what an uneven playing field that was. And I thought, from a storyteller's point of view, no one's telling their stories. And I saw that a role that I could play in amplifying those voices. And actually, from a gardener's point of view, I knew those stories would connect with my readers, because, as I said earlier, this makes no sense to a home gardener. And so I knew there was something there. So that was kind of when I thought, okay, I want to tell more stories. Let me find more people to write about, and let me visit more farms. And you visit a farm and you're hooked. You're like, oh my gosh, this is the this is the OG. This is the original where flowers come from, not a cooler or not cellophane wrapped bouquets, but this is the seed in the ground stuff. So, I was working on that book, The 50-Mile Bouquet, with a colleague who's a photographer, and we couldn't find a publisher for that book. This was in 2010. His name is David Perry, and he was equally obsessed with flower farm photos as I was with journalism. And we actually had even put some money together and hired a graphic designer to produce that book. We were going to self-publish. And then at the 11th hour, we found a publisher, St. Lynn's Press, which specializes in sustainable topics.
Oh, wow.
And that just gave us that opened the door, for all these other things.
Amazing. It's a great story. I agree with you. I personally love visiting farms just because the small farms where you can tell that, they're, it's like you said, it's diverse and it's small. They put the seeds in the ground themselves. And there's a feeling when you go to these farms, there's a feeling of sort of peace. I think it's because it's so connected with nature. And it's sort of this idea of being really closely tied with nature and working with nature in order to produce food, flowers, or whatever it is that you're growing.
I tell you, during COVID, it was the safest place to be. I had a contract to produce videos about flower farmers. It was a USDA grant. And I would go with the videographer. We visited 8 farms and produced 8 small videos. And, right in early days of COVID, I think our first filming was May 8th or something last year.
Wow.
And I said to the videographer, we're on 8 acres with 3 people. This is so much safer than going to Trader Joe's and buying groceries. We're going to be fine. And it was truly the gig that kept my mind at peace all of last year.
So helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Get out into nature and really see, just open space.
And meet people who are just like truly, committed to earning a living from their land in a sustainable way.
Yeah.
And that's really inspiring.
You mentioned the David and Goliath story of these small scale farmers that you visited them in comparison to this massive and we're seeing this kind of in the sustainability world everywhere. It's mirrored in many, many ways.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
How would you say, based on what you're seeing so far, how would you say that the Davids of the flower industry, so really these slow flower farmers who support the slow flower movement, how are they doing? How's it going?
Yeah, I mean, it's been really exciting to watch. I mean, they really have found their voice, and in most cases, they have become more entrepreneurial and more vocal about what they're offering their marketplace. And so that's been really, against the alternative, which is global floral culture, a reliance on trade policies that incentivize imports, cheap labor, maybe less stringent environmental practices. The micro farmer has more diversity, has what I call like artisanal or heirloom flower choices versus the shippable flowers, that kind of thing. So that farm to florist connection is strengthening. And the competitive edge that these small scale or innovative, micro farmers have is that their flowers, they're growing varieties that can't be shipped. So the big companies that are exporting to the US can't compete with sweet peas or, a dahlia or something that, is just needs to be transported in water. And that's the edge that, and luckily because of Instagram and florists, falling in love with these flowers, that's where the demand is. So it really benefits the farmer who is plugged in and really where like, okay, this is I can't compete on price. I can compete on quality and variety.
Yeah. And that makes sense. It's like what we were just saying about having that custom sort of bespoke, unique piece. An interesting question from Mubashir, who's saying that, so Mubashir usually gifts flower plants instead of cut flowers. And actually that's something I like to do too, bring a living plant in a pot of soil. Because as Mubashir says, they instead of lasting a couple days, they can last, in theory, years, depending
Yeah.
on the type of plant. Would you say this is more sustainable?
It's very sustainable. It's just a different aesthetic, in some, I think plants the plant world has not fallen to the challenges of the cut flower world because of, there are some interstate sales regulations on, like, for example, you have to have a permit to bring plants or cut flowers into the state of California because because it's an agriculture policy. They're worried about soil-borne pests and diseases. So it's kind of kept plants local more than flowers, just by nature of whatever those ag policies are. Also, the weight of shipping a pot with a root ball in soil is cost prohibitive. So the plant world hasn't become as, reliant on, like, the Amazon effect that the flower world has. It's definitely there. You can order plants online and have them shipped to you, but there's more restrictions and more limitations, and some of them are just pure financial. So in that regard, I really think that the nursery industry has benefited from being more local, and just, also we want to buy plants that are suitable to our zone, right? So we're probably getting them from a local nursery. If it's an indoor plant, that's a little bit different. And I love Mubashir's idea. I would love to have a plant as a gift, but I also love to have flowers as a gift.
Yeah. The way I balance that out is, well, usually this is probably not the most sustainable type of flower, but I love orchids as a gift. They're very classic, and they are beautiful, but they're probably not seasonal or local. Orchids are tricky, but they probably started in a lab in Asia and like became a little kind of like tissue culture that got massively shipped to somebody who grew it in the UK or in the US. So it's kind of like bulbs. Like every bulb that I grow, it started in Holland probably, but I'm growing that tulip in my garden, and seeds. The seed industry is international too. So, that's the next hill we're going to climb together, Daniel. Well, on that point, what are future innovations that you're seeing in the industry, or that you'd like to see in the flower farming and slow flowers and just floristry in general?
Well, every year we do I think for the last 7 years, we do an annual forecast. I don't use the word trend, but it's like a forecast for changes that are on the horizon or that we're documenting. Comes out the first Wednesday of every year. So usually the first week of January. And 2 years ago, I did forecast the increased demand more than ever for organic flower seeds. So in the seed industry, there's huge selection and availability of organic food, herb, and any kind of crop that you can grow in a food farm. That has not been the case in flowers, and so now growers are asking for that, and the industry is trying to catch up. The seed providers are trying to breed and produce organic flower seeds, so that's exciting. I think I mentioned a little bit about the flower farmer empowerment, like how farmers are really leading instead of just being responsive. And one of the innovations I'm seeing is how all across North America, there are collectives, cooperatives, co-marketing groups, whatever way you want to define it, of farmers coming together and creating their own marketplace, their own wholesale hub. So that is happening in a really exciting way. The one that I'm involved in is just celebrated its 10th year. It's a legal cooperative called the Seattle Wholesale Growers Market. And it is owned by about 15 or 16 farms in Oregon and Washington, and they own their own distribution. So that is now there's people modeling, their own version of that all across the country, and mainly in demographic hubs. Like, there's one in New Jersey and one in Connecticut, and they're basically serving the New York market. They're, just by virtue of it's cheaper to have have something outside of the city. There's one in North Carolina. There's one in the Twin Cities. There's one in Toronto. So this is happening, in an exciting way that farmers are driving.
Is it almost like a CSA?
No, it's like it's more like they're selling wholesale to the trade only, to florists.
Oh, I see.
So it's like the middleman is gone now. The farmer is his own middleman because the farmers are collectively coming together to sell their flowers to the florists.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Now, not to bash the middleman, because wholesalers do play an essential role, but really they could be selling anything. They buy bulk and sell to someone who can't buy bulk. They're like redistributors. There is a softening of resistance to local flowers in those channels. There are some people who are doing it really well and who have local departments within their warehouse where all the local or American grown flowers are. There's others who all the evidence is staring them in the face and they won't change. So bye-bye. And the other innovation I would mention is that florists are disrupting this traditional wholesale distribution channel by doing what I do, going direct to flower farmers and, developing relationships, because as they develop relationships with flower farmers, then they can tell their clients, hey, I knew the person who grew this, and you know what? This is a fabulous flower. It's seasonal. It has a story. You're going to want it for your event or your wedding or your vase on the center, in the center of your table. Like, it's creating, and this is why we have so many new members in Slow Flowers. These florists need to connect with the farmers so that they can differentiate themselves in their own marketplace and be, that's the sustainable florist, or that's the florist who cares about local. And that's just what we've seen happen with restaurants. It's just paralleling finally in the floral industry. So
I love it. It's really about, to me, it sounds like kind of the overarching theme here is almost using technology to bring people who are close together, because sometimes it's difficult to find these individuals and really know where to look. And but yeah, I think those are all great points. For a question that came to mind is you're focused, slowflowers.com is focused really on the USA and Canada currently. What about internationally? I mean, most of the flowers, as we talked about, come from international, come from other countries into the US. So is this kind of movement also being seen, or have you seen or heard of it happening abroad, meaning Europe or South America, Africa?
Oh yeah, there are people who have completely co-opted the Slow Flowers hashtag and put their country on it.
Wonderful.
There's one organization has chosen to affiliate with us, and it's Slow Flowers Italy. And I'm trying to align myself with like one group in every country and let them be an official affiliate. But there are, any of the kind of, as I said earlier, countries that have seen a lot of their agriculture outsourced, Australia, all throughout Europe. And, those are mainly where we're seeing it. In the UK, there's a group that is grown up very similar to Slow Flowers, kind of around the same time. They actually just celebrated their 10th anniversary. It's called Flowers from the Farm. And I just want to tell you about that because you're in the UK and you need to know them. But it's so exciting. It's basically a directory of farmers growing flowers in the UK and probably maybe into Scotland and Ireland as well. Fabulous people. I've spent time with Jillian Hodgson, the founder, and visited them. They've hosted me. I've seen her when she's been in the US, but that is they're doing their own thing, and I love it because we share resources and ideas with each other, and very similar issues with they're the Davids to the Goliath of the the large scale flower importers.
Well, that's Flowers from the Farm. I'll take a look. It sounds they sound like they're doing some fantastic work.
They're awesome. Yeah, you got to have them on the show next.
Yeah, that'd be amazing.
Yeah. We're going to turn you into a flower journalist very soon, Daniel.
Sounds great. Different. I suppose that's a more literal translation or literal usage of flower child.
That's right.
Yeah. Are there any sustainability leaders that you admire, or perhaps a book or a podcast or even a TV show or something in the flower world, in addition, of course, to your books, that that you can recommend to our audience?
Absolutely. Well, my favorite is called the Sustainable Flowers Podcast. And it's the hosts are two of our Slow Flowers members from Alberta, Canada. And they're two flower farmers, Heather Henson and Clara Qualitza. Heather owns Boreal Blooms, and Clara owns Meadow and Thicket Farm Flowers. They started this podcast because the population is very low in Alberta. They're, I think, 4 or 5 hours away from each other, and they just were having conversations about how to farm sustainably in zone 4 or whatever. And so they just started recording their conversations. Now they have fabulous, they've really gotten down and dirty about what it means to grow sustainably. And it's a great podcast. So the Sustainable Flowers Podcast, I would definitely recommend. In terms of books, I will just mention, in the boredom of COVID, I started a publishing company with a colleague, and the company is called Bloom Imprint. And we, our first book just came out. It's called Where We Bloom, and it's it's very much a lifestyle book. It's stories of the creative spaces where flower farmers and florists do their work.
Beautiful.
But we have a couple books coming up later, one this year and one next year, that are more in the sustainable realm. One is a book called Growing Wonder, and it's by Felicia Alvarez, and she is she grows garden roses for the floral trade, and it's all about organic and sustainable practices. And so that's coming out in September. The subtitle is basically a florist's guide to growing garden roses.
Okay. And
then we have a book coming out in 2022 by a small scale farming couple, Adam and Jennifer O'Neill. They are in Iowa, and they're really showing people how you can have a successful farm-based business, even if you only have 1 acre, and build it around flowers. And that's going to be called Small Farm, Big Dreams. So if you come to my website, you can find links to all of that stuff. So sounds
very good. And what is that website, in case someone's looking up right now?
I would start with slowflowerssociety.com. That's sort of our umbrella where all of our channels are. And I don't think the publishing company is there yet, so I'll have to link it up. But it's Bloom Imprint. So
sounds very good.
The thing is, every time I have a new idea, I start a new website. It's really unfortunate. I'm not very well organized, but now I'm trying to channel them all through one front door. So
I'm sure you'll get there soon enough.
Oh, geez, Daniel.
What can people do on a daily basis to be more sustainable in their daily lives?
Well, of course, I'm going to give you a flower answer. I hope that's
that sounds
okay.
Very good. Absolutely.
Ask questions. Ask, where was this flower grown? Who grew it? What practices were used? Demand that information. And when I go to the grocery store, I always do this. And, unfortunately, I've got some junior clerk who doesn't know anything and has to go get the manager, and the manager doesn't know anything. Like this, the corporations want us to not know. So that's where I say demand proper labeling. But of course, grow your own flowers, meet flower farmers, and just remember the magic of flowers. They've been symbols for millennia and played an important role in history of the world. But now we're seeing that flowers are here for our mental health and wellness as well. And, everyone should enjoy that.
Absolutely. And Nicholas Arises just says, thank you for the knowledge. And he's totally changing his flower buying habits now.
Awesome, Nicholas. I love it. That's so great. Well, anyone can do it. I mean, on a packet of seeds is a couple dollars, or I don't know what it would be the equivalent for you. But less than a cup of coffee at Starbucks, you can grow your own flowers.
And I think that's the easiest way. That's the most local that you can do. And if you're growing them indoors, which some are easy to do, then you don't even need to step outside to get flowers.
Okay. I love it.
So you mentioned Slowflowerscom. Is there anywhere else people should go if they want to learn more about your work, check out your books, become a member of the Slow Flowers movement? What's the best way to
all of that. You can find everything. And we do have a membership level for supporters and enthusiasts, just people who care about this. They're not ever going to be professional, but they just want to support the conversation and learn more. And so kind of like joining a garden club. So we've got that level of membership, which is pretty nominal. And then I would say I do have a weekly podcast. It's called the Slow Flowers Podcast. You can download that wherever you download your podcasts. It is not video, but Danielle, you're inspiring me to go video later this summer. But right now it's audio only.
Well, hopefully soon we'll start watching the conversations as well as listening to them. Yeah, well, Debra, thank you very much for your time. And so we have Debra Prinzing here from the Slow Flower Movement. And thank you again for joining us today to talk about the importance of sourcing local, seasonal, and sustainable flowers. So Debra, thank you very much. And thank you for everyone for listening in today.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I enjoyed it so much.
Take care.